The dusty air of Nebraska City burned in Thomas Garrett's lungs as he stood before the weathered bulletin board outside the sheriff's office, his hand frozen inches from the crumpled wanted poster that had just stolen the breath from his chest. The face staring back at him belonged to the only woman he had ever truly loved, and the words beneath her portrait declared her wanted for murder. It was August of 1873, and the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the main street, turning the packed earth into something that felt like walking on hot coals. Thomas had been checking the board out of habit more than anything else, the same way he had done every time he rode into town for supplies over the past 3 years. But today, everything changed. Today, he saw Grace Gardner's face rendered in crude ink, her eyes still holding that same defiant spark he remembered from their childhood, though the artist had tried to make her look hardened and dangerous. His hands trembled as he reached up and tore the poster down, crumpling it against his chest as he glanced around to see if anyone had noticed. The street was busy with the usual afternoon commerce, farmers and ranchers conducting business, women with parasols ducking in and out of the general store, children chasing a hoop down the wooden sidewalk. No one paid him any mind. Thomas shoved the poster into his saddlebag and mounted his roan gelding in one fluid motion, his heart hammering against his ribs. Grace Gardner. The name alone conjured memories that he had tried to bury for 3 years. She had disappeared without a trace one winter morning, leaving behind only a hastily written note that said she had to go, that she could never explain why, that he should forget her. He had been 22 then, she 21, and they had been planning to marry that spring. Her father had approved of the match, pleased that his only daughter would be marrying the son of a respected cattle rancher. Everything had been perfect until it was not. Thomas rode hard out of Nebraska City, the poster burning a hole in his consciousness. The charges listed armed robbery and the murder of a banker in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory. The reward was $500. Grace's face had been etched with surprising accuracy, despite the limitations of the medium, right down to the small scar above her left eyebrow that she had gotten falling from a tree when they were children. He knew with absolute certainty that Grace was not a murderer. She had cried when her cat died, had nursed injured birds back to health, had stood between him and a rattlesnake once, risking her own life to warn him. Whatever had happened in Cheyenne, whatever circumstances had led to her face being plastered on wanted posters across 3 territories, there had to be an explanation. The Garrett Ranch sat 15 miles outside of Nebraska City, a sprawling property of good grazing land and a sturdy house his father had built with his own hands 30 years ago. Thomas's father, William, was sitting on the porch when Thomas rode up at a gallop, dust billowing behind him. "What has got you riding like the devil himself is chasing you?" William called out, setting down his pipe. Thomas dismounted and pulled the crumpled poster from his saddlebag. "It's Grace. She's wanted for murder in Wyoming." William's weathered face went pale as he studied the poster. He had always been fond of Grace, had been looking forward to having her as a daughter-in-law. "This cannot be right. That girl would not hurt a fly." "I know." Thomas paced the length of the porch, his boots creating a rhythmic thud against the wood. "I need to find her, Pa. I need to know what happened. Wyoming territory is a big place, son, and if she is running from the law, she will not be easy to find." William handed the poster back, his expression troubled. "But I can see from your face that nothing I say will change your mind. I have to go. I should have gone looking for her 3 years ago instead of accepting that note." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I should have known she would not leave unless something was terribly wrong." William nodded slowly. Then you will need supplies, and you will need to be smart about this. If she is wanted for murder, there will be bounty hunters and lawmen both looking for her. You go asking the wrong questions in the wrong places, you will lead them right to her. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Thomas packed food that would keep, extra ammunition for his rifle and revolver, bedroll, canteen, and enough money to last several months if needed. His mother, Elizabeth, emerged from the kitchen with tears in her eyes, pressing a bundle of her famous dried beef and hardtack into his hands. "You bring that girl home," she said fiercely. "You bring her home and we will sort out this mess together. The Gardners have been good neighbors and friends for 20 years. I will not believe Grace killed anyone in cold blood." Thomas left before dawn the next morning, pointing his horse west toward Wyoming. The journey would take him through the sandhills of Nebraska and into the rugged territory beyond. He had the poster memorized now, every detail of the charges. The murder had allegedly occurred on March 15, 1873, 5 months ago. The victim was listed as Harrison Blackwell, president of the Cheyenne First National Bank. As he rode, Thomas let his mind drift back to the last time he had seen Grace. It had been Christmas Eve of 1869, and they had stood together under the stars behind her father's barn, sharing secrets and stolen kisses. She had been radiant in the moonlight, her long auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her green eyes bright with happiness. They had talked about their future, about the ranch they would build together, about the children they would have. "I want at least 4, she had said, laughing. 2 boys and 2 girls. "We will have as many as you want," he had promised, pulling her close. "As long as I have you, nothing else matters." But something had changed after Christmas. Grace had become distant, distracted. When he asked her what was wrong, she insisted everything was fine, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Then came that February morning when he arrived at the Gardner place to find her gone and her father, Jonathan, looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. "She left this," Jonathan had said, handing over the note with shaking hands. "She did not even say goodbye to my face." Thomas had read the note 100 times, looking for hidden meanings, for some clue about where she had gone or why. There was nothing, just those terrible words about leaving and forgetting. He camped that first night beside a small creek, the stars spread out above him like diamonds on black velvet. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and he felt very small and very alone. But he was also filled with a sense of purpose that he had not felt in 3 years. He was finally doing something instead of just existing in the hollow shell that his life had become without Grace. The next day brought him to the town of Sydney, a rough settlement that had sprung up along the Union Pacific Railroad. He kept his questions careful and vague, asking about travelers heading west, about anyone who might have seen a woman matching Grace's description. The answers were mostly shrugs and suspicious looks. People in these border towns knew better than to talk too freely about strangers. It was in a saloon called the Golden Spike that Thomas got his first real lead. The bartender, a grizzled man with a scar running down one cheek, studied him carefully before speaking. "You law or bounty hunter?" the bartender asked, wiping down the bar with a dirty rag. "Neither. Just looking for someone. We get a lot of folks through here looking for someone. Usually those someones do not want to be found." The bartender's eyes were shrewd. "But I will tell you this. About 4 months back, a young woman came through here. Red hair, green eyes, scared as a rabbit. She bought a horse and supplies and headed north toward the Black Hills. Paid in cash and did not say more than 2 words. North, not west," Thomas frowned. "The Black Hills were in Dakota Territory, not Wyoming." "North," the bartender confirmed. I remember because I thought it was strange. Most folks heading that way are miners or hunters. Not many women travel alone in that direction. Thomas thanked him and left, his mind racing. If Grace had been in Sydney 4 months ago, that was shortly after the murder in Cheyenne. But why head north instead of east toward home? What was she running from, or running to? He followed the lead north, tracking through increasingly rugged terrain. The sandhills gave way to pine-covered ridges and deep valleys. He passed through small settlements and mining camps, always asking careful questions, always listening for any mention of a woman traveling alone. In a town called Custer City, he found his next piece of the puzzle. A woman running a boarding house remembered Grace clearly. "Pretty thing, but so sad," the woman said, her face sympathetic. "She stayed here 2 nights, kept to herself mostly, but I heard her crying in her room one night and I brought her some tea. She was grateful for the kindness and we talked a little." "What did she tell you?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. "Not much, but she said she had made a terrible mistake trying to help someone and now everything was ruined. She said she could never go home because people would not understand." The boarding house owner shook her head. "I got the feeling she was running from something or someone. When she left, she asked me which way would take her furthest from civilization. I told her to head northwest, toward the Montana Territory. There is nothing out that way but wilderness and a few trading posts." Thomas felt his hope and despair warring within him. Grace was heading deeper into the frontier, further from everything and everyone she knew. But at least she was alive, and he was on her trail. Montana Territory in late summer of 1873 was beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Thomas crossed into the territory after 2 more weeks of hard riding, following the thin thread of Grace's passage through the recollections of traders, prospectors, and isolated homesteaders. Each person remembered her because a woman traveling alone was unusual enough to stick in the memory. At a trading post along the Yellowstone River, he finally got the break he had been hoping for. The trader, a French-Canadian named Baptiste, studied the poster Thomas showed him and nodded immediately. "She is working at her ranch about 20 miles west of here," Baptiste said. "The Holloway place." They needed help with the cooking and cleaning after Mrs. Holloway took sick. "The girl showed up about 2 months back, said her name was Mary Sullivan, but I knew she was hiding from something. She had that look, you know, like a deer that hears the hunter but cannot yet see him." Thomas's hands were shaking as he rolled up the poster. "Is she safe there? Are the Holloways good people?" "Good enough," Baptiste said. "Jack Holloway is fair and his wife is kind. They do not ask too many questions, which is probably why the girl felt safe going there. But mister, if you are planning to go there, you should know there has been other men asking about her too. Men with guns and hard eyes, bounty hunters." Ice flooded Thomas's veins. How long ago? 3 days. They were headed in that direction when they left here. Thomas did not waste another moment. He bought fresh supplies, let his horse drink deeply from the river, and set out immediately even though dusk was falling. 20 miles. He could cover that distance by midnight if he pushed hard. The moon was high when he finally spotted the lights of the Holloway ranch house, a solid log structure with a barn and several outbuildings. Everything looked peaceful, but Thomas felt his instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. He dismounted and approached on foot, leading his horse, staying in the shadows. Then he heard the voices. Male voices, rough and demanding, coming from inside the house. Through the window he could see 2 men in long coats, both armed. A middle-aged couple sat at the table looking frightened. And there, standing near the fireplace with her hands clenched at her sides, was Grace. She looked different than he remembered. Thinner, her face drawn and tired. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a plain calico dress. But it was unmistakably her, and the sight of her after 3 years hit Thomas like a physical blow. "We know you are Grace Gardner," one of the bounty hunters was saying. "We have the poster, and your face matches perfectly. You might as well come peaceful-like. There is a reward on your head, and we aim to collect it." "I have told you, my name is Mary Sullivan," Grace said, and her voice was the same as Thomas remembered, clear and strong even with fear threading through it. "I do not know anything about any wanted poster. Do not play games, girl. We are taking you back to Wyoming to stand trial for murder. Now you can come quiet, or we can make this hard. Your choice." Thomas moved without thinking, drawing his revolver as he kicked open the front door. Both bounty hunters spun toward him, reaching for their weapons, but Thomas had the advantage of surprise. "I would not," Thomas said quietly, his gun steady in his hand. "Put your weapons on the table, slowly." The bounty hunters assessed him, clearly trying to decide if they could take him. Thomas let his eyes go cold, let them see that he was prepared to shoot if necessary. After a tense moment, they carefully drew their guns and placed them on the table. Grace was staring at him like she was seeing a ghost. "Thomas," she whispered. "Hello, Grace," he said, still keeping his gun trained on the bounty hunters. "We need to talk, but first these gentlemen are going to leave." "The hell we are," one of them growled. "That girl is wanted for murder. There is a legal reward. You are interfering with the law." "I am interfering with bounty hunters, which is different," Thomas said. "And I am asking you to leave. Mr. Holloway, would you be so kind as to hand me their weapons?" Jack Holloway, looking both relieved and nervous, picked up the guns and brought them to Thomas. Thomas tucked them into his belt, never taking his eyes off the two men. "You can collect your weapons from the trading post at the river," Thomas said. "I will leave them with Baptiste tomorrow. Now get out and do not come back." The bounty hunters looked like they wanted to argue, but they were outgunned and they knew it. With muttered curses, they stalked out of the house. Thomas watched through the window as they mounted their horses and rode off into the night. Only then did he lower his gun and turn to face Grace fully. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth. The Holloways stood uncertainly, looking between them. "I think we will give you two some privacy, Mrs." Holloway said gently, taking her husband's arm and leading him toward the bedroom. For a long moment, Thomas and Grace just stared at each other across the length of the room. 3 years. 3 years of grief and confusion and unanswered questions. And now here they were, and Thomas did not even know where to begin. "How did you find me?" Grace finally asked, her voice breaking. "I saw your face on a wanted poster in Nebraska City. I tore it down and started riding." Thomas holstered his gun and took a step toward her. "Grace, what happened? Why did you leave? What is this about a murder in Cheyenne?" She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You should not have come. It is not safe for you to be associated with me." "I do not care about safe," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I care about you. I have cared about you since we were children. When you left, it was like someone tore out my heart. And then I see your face on a poster claiming you killed someone, and you think I am just going to walk away." "I did not kill anyone," Grace said, spinning back to face him. "But I cannot prove it. And the man who actually did it is powerful enough that no one will believe me over him." "Then tell me everything." Grace sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Do you remember my cousin Martin? He lived in Cheyenne, worked as a clerk at the bank." Thomas nodded. He had met Martin Gardner a few times, a quiet man in his 30s. "That last winter before I left, Martin sent me a letter. He said he had discovered something terrible, something dangerous, and he did not know who to trust. He asked if he could come stay with us for a while." Grace's hands twisted in her lap. I told Father and we invited Martin to come. He arrived in January of 1870. I remember, Thomas said slowly. You said he was visiting. He told us what he had discovered. The bank president, Harrison Blackwell, was embezzling money from the bank. Large amounts over several years. Martin had found the evidence while doing routine bookkeeping. He had copies of ledgers, documentation of false accounts, everything needed to prove Blackwell's guilt. Thomas felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. What happened? Martin wanted to go to the territorial authorities, but he was afraid. Blackwell was wealthy and connected. Martin worried that no one would believe a clerk over the bank president. He wanted to gather more evidence first. Grace's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But someone found out. One night in February, men came to our house. They demanded Martin give them the documents. Father tried to protect him. They shot Father, Thomas. They shot him right in front of me. My God, Thomas breathed. Jonathan Gardner had supposedly died of pneumonia that February. That was what everyone had been told. Martin managed to escape with the documents, but they caught up to him 2 days later and killed him too. They made it look like an accident, a robbery gone wrong. Grace was crying again, the tears falling silently. Before he died, Martin had sent the documents to me, hidden in a box of books. I did not even know I had them until after he was dead. That is when Blackwell's men came for me. That is why you ran, Thomas said, understanding flooding through him. You ran to protect yourself and to protect everyone else. If you had stayed, they would have killed you too. I went to Cheyenne to try to turn the evidence over to someone in authority, someone who might actually do something with it. But Blackwell found out I was there. He sent his men after me. I hid in the bank after hours trying to find someone, anyone who might help. Blackwell came in late that night alone. He saw me. He drew a gun. Grace's whole body was shaking now. There was a struggle. The gun went off. He fell and hit his head on the corner of his desk. There was so much blood. I panicked and ran. I did not even take the documents with me. And now I am wanted for his murder, and the evidence of his crimes probably disappeared the moment his body was discovered. Thomas crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest, and he held her tight, his own eyes burning with tears. All this time, she had been running and scared and alone, carrying the weight of her father's murder and her cousin's death, accused of a crime she did not commit. We will fix this, he said fiercely. I promise you, Grace, we will find a way to fix this. How? She asked brokenly. Blackwell is dead. The evidence is gone. It is my word against a dead man's reputation, and I am the one they want to hang. Then we find new evidence. There has to be someone else who knew what Blackwell was doing. Embezzlers do not work in a vacuum. There will be others involved, or at least others who knew. Thomas pulled back to look at her face, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears. And we are not going to do this alone. My father has connections. Judge Morrison owes him a favor. We will get you a fair hearing, I swear it. Your father, Grace said, a new fear entering her eyes. How is he, and your mother? And what about my father's ranch? I had to leave everything behind. My parents are well, and they are going to be overjoyed that you are alive. As for your father's place, it has been maintained. My father made sure of it. He never believed you would just abandon it forever. Thomas kept his voice gentle, not wanting to cause her more pain. Grace, they all know your father did not die of pneumonia. The doctor who examined him knew it was a gunshot wound. But there was pressure applied, pressure from people with money and influence to keep quiet about it. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia to avoid an investigation that might lead to uncomfortable questions. Grace closed her eyes. More of Blackwell's doing. Most likely. But he is gone now, and dead men cannot apply pressure. They talked through the rest of the night, Thomas pulling every detail from Grace that he could. The Holloways emerged at dawn and insisted on making breakfast, treating both Thomas and Grace with the kind of simple kindness that reminded Thomas why he loved the frontier, for all its harshness. People out here understood survival and loyalty. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need," Jack Holloway said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of them. "But those bounty hunters will be back, probably with reinforcements. If you are planning to do something, you should do it soon." Thomas nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. "Grace, I need you to trust me. I am going to take you back to Nebraska." She started to protest, but he held up his hand. "Not to turn you in, to get you somewhere safe while I go to Cheyenne and see what I can find. There has to be records, has to be someone who can corroborate your story about the embezzlement. And I want to talk to the territorial marshal, see what the actual evidence against you is." "It is too dangerous," Grace said. "If they connect you to me, you will be charged as an accomplice." "Then we will be careful. But Grace, I am not losing you again. I am not spending another 3 years wondering where you are or if you are safe." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "I found you. That is the hard part. Now we just have to clear your name." She looked at their joined hands, and for the first time since he had found her, Thomas saw a spark of hope in her eyes. "You really think we can do this?" "I know we can." They left the Holloway Ranch that afternoon with gratitude and promises to write once things were settled. Thomas returned the bounty hunter's weapons to Baptiste at the trading post, along with a warning that anyone else coming after Grace would have to go through him first. The journey back to Nebraska was both easier and harder than the journey out had been. Easier because Thomas knew the route now, because he had Grace beside him instead of just chasing her shadow. Harder because every town they passed through, every stranger they encountered, was a potential threat. Thomas kept the wanted poster, now creased and worn from his saddlebag, carefully hidden. They traveled as brother and sister when they had to interact with others, keeping their stories vague and their stays brief. At night, camping under the stars, they slowly began to rebuild the connection that had been severed 3 years ago. They talked about everything, the years apart, the pain of separation, the grief they had both carried. Thomas told her about how he had tried to move on, how his mother had introduced him to several suitable young women from neighboring ranches, how he had never felt even a flicker of interest in any of them, because they were not Grace. Grace told him about her flight west, about the fear that had been her constant companion, about the nights she had cried herself to sleep thinking about everyone she had left behind. She told him about the close calls with the law, the times she had barely escaped detection, the loneliness of being completely alone in the world. "I thought about writing to you so many times," she admitted one night as they sat by the fire. "But I was afraid it would put you in danger. And I was afraid that after 3 years you would have moved on, that you would be married to someone else, happy without me." "There is no happy without you," Thomas said simply. "There is only existing." She looked at him across the flames, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I missed you every single day. I know I broke your heart when I left, but Thomas, mine was just as broken." "Then let us put them back together," he said, moving around the fire to sit beside her. "Let us fix this mess and go home and build the life we always planned." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you really think it is possible, after everything that has happened?" "I think anything is possible as long as we are together." They reached the Garrett ranch in mid-September, the autumn air turning crisp and the leaves beginning to show hints of gold and red. Thomas's mother actually screamed when she saw Grace, and then she was crying and hugging her and thanking God all in the same breath. William stood on the porch with tears in his eyes, nodding at his son with pride. "You found her," was all he said, but those words carried worlds of meaning. They set Grace up in the guest room, and Elizabeth would not hear of her doing any work around the house. "You have been through enough," she said firmly. "Now you rest and let us take care of things." Thomas spent the next few days preparing for his trip to Cheyenne. His father helped him draft a letter to Judge Morrison, carefully outlining the situation without revealing too much in case the letter was intercepted. They also sent word to a lawyer in Omaha, a man William had done business with who had a reputation for taking on difficult cases. "You need to be careful in Cheyenne," William warned. "If Blackwell was as corrupt as Grace says, he probably had people working with him. They will not appreciate someone poking around, stirring up old business." "I will be careful," Thomas promised. The night before he left, he and Grace took a walk along the creek that ran through the property. It was the same creek where they used to fish as children, where Thomas had kissed her for the first time when they were 16. "I am scared," Grace admitted, picking up a smooth stone and tossing it into the water. "I am scared that you will go to Cheyenne and find nothing, or worse, that you will be hurt because of me." "I am scared too," Thomas said honestly, "but I am more scared of doing nothing." "Grace, you have been running for 3 years. It is time to stand and fight." She turned to face him, the moonlight turning her hair to dark copper. "Why are you doing this? You could have stayed in Nebraska City. You could have burned that poster and gone on with your life. Why risk everything for me?" Thomas took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that had not been there 3 years ago, evidence of the hard life she had been living. "Because I love you. I have loved you since we were children playing in this creek. I loved you when you left, even though I did not understand why. I loved you every day you were gone, and I will love you for the rest of my life. That is not something I can walk away from, Grace. That is not something I would ever want to walk away from." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too. I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment." He kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as 3 years of longing and loss poured into that connection. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I am going to marry you if you will still have me." "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." Thomas left for Cheyenne at dawn, carrying letters of introduction, his father's good name behind him, and a determination to see justice done. The journey took him a week, and he used the time to plan his approach. He could not just start asking questions about Harrison Blackwell without raising suspicions. He needed to be subtle, clever. Cheyenne was a bustling city by frontier standards, the territorial capital and a hub for the railroad. The streets were crowded with freight wagons, cattle herds being driven to the stockyards, businessmen in suits and cowboys fresh from the range. Thomas checked into a modest hotel and spent his first day just observing, getting a feel for the town. The bank where Blackwell had been president was an imposing building of red brick and white columns, designed to inspire confidence and trust. A sign out front announced new management, a man named Theodore Carlson. Thomas made note of that and continued his reconnaissance. On his second day, he visited the territorial marshal's office. The marshal was a lean man in his 50s named Daniel Sawyer, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I am looking for information about a case from earlier this year," Thomas said, keeping his tone casual. "The murder of Harrison Blackwell. I heard there is a warrant out for a woman named Grace Gardner." Marshal Sawyer studied him carefully. "That is correct. Do you have information about her whereabouts?" "No, sir. I am just trying to understand the case." "You see, I knew Miss Gardner back in Nebraska. She was a neighbor, and I have a hard time believing she would commit murder." Thomas let sincerity ring in his voice because it was the absolute truth. "I was wondering what evidence there is against her." The marshal leaned back in his chair. "The evidence is circumstantial but strong. Blackwell was found dead in his office, shot in the head. There were witnesses who saw Miss Gardner in the bank that night. She fled the scene and has been running ever since. Innocent people do not run, Mr. Garrett." "Scared people run," Thomas countered. "If I can speak plainly, Marshal, I have known Grace Gardner since we were children. She is not a killer. Is it possible there is more to this story than what appears on the surface?" Marshal Sawyer was quiet for a long moment. "You are asking dangerous questions, Mr. Garrett." "I am asking honest questions." The marshal sighed and pulled a file from his desk drawer. "Off the record, there have been some irregularities with this case that have bothered me from the start. Blackwell's associates pushed hard for the warrant on Miss Gardner, but the actual physical evidence is thin. The gun that killed him was never found. There were no witnesses to the actual shooting, only to her presence in the building. And when I tried to investigate Blackwell's affairs more thoroughly, I was met with resistance from some very influential people." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of resistance?" "The kind that suggests there were secrets worth protecting." "But without proof, without someone willing to testify, my hands are tied." Marshal Sawyer looked at Thomas directly. "If you know where Miss Gardner is, bring her in so she can tell her side of the story properly. I promise you a fair hearing in my jurisdiction. And if her side of the story implicates other powerful people in criminal activity, then those people will answer to the law, regardless of their position." The marshal's voice was firm. "I did not become a lawman to protect the guilty, Mr. Garrett. I became one to serve justice." Thomas left the marshal's office feeling more hopeful than he had in weeks. But he still needed evidence, still needed something concrete to support Grace's account of events. He spent the next several days haunting the saloons and boarding houses near the bank, talking to clerks and secretaries, buying drinks and listening to gossip. It was in a saloon called the Silver Dollar that he finally caught a break. A man named Robert Pierce, who had worked as a junior clerk under Martin Gardner, got drunk enough to start talking after Thomas bought him several rounds. "Martin was a good man," Pierce said, his words slurring slightly. "Best bookkeeper the bank ever had. It is a shame what happened to him." "I heard he was killed in a robbery," Thomas said carefully. Pierce laughed bitterly. "That is what they said, was it not? But Martin was not killed by robbers. He was killed because he found out what Blackwell was doing. We all knew it. Everyone who worked at the bank knew it, but nobody would say anything because Blackwell had friends in high places." "What was he doing?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Embezzling. Thousands of dollars, maybe more. Martin found the proof, and then suddenly Martin was dead and his papers disappeared." Pierce took another drink. "And then that poor girl showed up, Martin's cousin, and she died too, or that is what I heard." "She is not dead," Thomas said quietly. Pierce's eyes widened. "What?" "Grace Gardner is alive and she is innocent of murder. But she needs people who will testify to what really happened, who will corroborate her story about Blackwell's embezzlement." Thomas leaned forward. "Will you testify, Mr. Pierce? Will you help me prove the truth?" Pierce looked terrified. "I have a family. I have children. The people who killed Martin and came after that girl, they will not hesitate to come after me. Marshal Sawyer will protect you. He is a good man, an honest man. He wants the truth as much as we do." Thomas pressed his advantage. "How many more people have to die or have their lives ruined to protect a dead man's secrets? Blackwell is gone. Now is the time to expose what he did." Pierce struggled with himself, fear and conscience warring visibly on his face. Finally, he nodded. "I will do it. God help me, I will testify. But you have to promise me that my family will be kept safe." "I promise," Thomas said. Over the next week, Thomas worked with Marshal Sawyer to build a case. Pierce provided detailed testimony about the embezzlement, including dates and amounts. He also revealed that Blackwell's partner in the scheme had been a man named Charles Whitmore, a railroad executive who had used his position to funnel money through the bank's accounts. With Pierce's testimony, Marshal Sawyer was able to get a warrant to search the bank's records. What they found was damning. Evidence of systematic fraud going back years, false accounts, forged documents, and a trail of money that led directly to Blackwell and Whitmore. Whitmore was arrested while trying to flee to California. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a long prison sentence, he agreed to provide testimony about Blackwell's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. Part of that testimony included admitting that he had hired men to kill Martin Gardner and Jonathan Gardner, and that the orders to eliminate Grace Gardner had come directly from Blackwell himself. With Whitmore's confession and Pierce's testimony, Marshal Sawyer officially cleared Grace of all charges. The wanted posters were recalled, and a formal apology was issued by the territorial government. Thomas sent a telegram to his father with 2 words: "She's cleared." He arrived back in Nebraska City in late October, the autumn colors in full glory across the prairie. The entire town turned out when word spread that Grace Gardner was coming home, exonerated and free. There were tears and embraces and apologies from people who had believed the worst. Thomas found Grace waiting for him on the porch of his parents' house, and the sight of her smiling, really smiling without fear or shadows in her eyes, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He dismounted and took the steps 2 at a time, sweeping her up in his arms. "It is over," he said. "You are free." She was crying and laughing at the same time, holding on to him like she would never let go. "I cannot believe it. I cannot believe you actually did it." "We did it," he corrected. "Together." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Nebraska City. Grace wore a dress of ivory silk that had been her mother's, carefully preserved all these years. Thomas wore his best suit, though he felt awkward in it compared to his usual ranch clothes. But none of that mattered when he saw Grace walking down the aisle toward him, her face radiant with joy. Judge Morrison himself performed the ceremony, pleased to be part of a happy ending after so many years of tragedy. The whole town attended, along with families from neighboring ranches, everyone who had known and loved the Gardners and the Garretts. When Thomas said his vows, his voice was strong and clear. "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you for all the days of my life. I promise to never give up on you, no matter what challenges we face. You are my heart, Grace, and you always will be." Grace's vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to trust you, to share my burdens with you, and to never run from you again. You saved me, Thomas, in every way a person can be saved. I will spend the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am that you tore down that poster and came to find me." They honeymooned at Grace's father's old ranch, which Thomas had spent the past month renovating and preparing. It was smaller than the Garrett place, but it had good land and a solid house, and most importantly, it was theirs. They worked side by side to make it a home, planting an autumn garden, repairing fences, planning for the future. On a cool November evening, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Grace was curled against Thomas's side, his arm around her shoulders, and everything felt right in a way that it had not for 3 long years. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had not seen that poster?" Grace asked quietly. "Every day," Thomas admitted. I think about how I might have spent the rest of my life not knowing where you were or if you were safe. I think about how close I came to losing you forever. I think about it too. I think about how I was ready to spend the rest of my life running and hiding, believing I could never come home. She tilted her head to look up at him. You gave me my life back, Thomas. How do I ever thank you for that? You already have, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You married me. You chose to build a life with me. That is all the thanks I will ever need. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Thomas thought about everything they had been through, all the pain and fear and uncertainty. But they had come through it together, and they were stronger for it. I want to start our family, Grace said suddenly. I want to fill this house with children and laughter and love. I want to create so much happiness that it wipes away all the sadness that came before. Thomas smiled. 4 children, was that not what you said? 2 boys and 2 girls. At least 4, she said, laughing. Maybe more. We have a lot of time to make up for. Then we better get started, Thomas said, standing and pulling her up with him. He swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the house as she laughed and protested that she could walk perfectly well. But he did not put her down until they were inside. The door closed against the night, and it was just the 2 of them in the home they were building together. The years that followed were everything they had dreamed of and more. Grace gave birth to their first child in the summer of 1874, a boy they named William Jonathan, after both their fathers. He had Thomas's dark hair and Grace's green eyes, and he was healthy and strong and perfect. 2 years later came their daughter, Elizabeth Marie, named for Thomas's mother and Grace's mother. She was a spirited child who reminded everyone of Grace as a girl, always climbing trees and chasing after her older brother. In 1878, they had twin boys, Thomas Jr. and James, who kept them busy and exhausted and laughing constantly. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Grace proved to have a natural head for business, managing the books and handling the sales, while Thomas oversaw the day-to-day operations of raising cattle and horses. They became pillars of the community, respected and loved. Grace started a small school on their property for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching reading and arithmetic and history. Thomas served on the town council, helping to shape Nebraska City's growth into the new century. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally in bed and they had a moment to themselves, Thomas and Grace would sit together on the porch, just as they had on their honeymoon. They would talk about their day, make plans for the future, or simply enjoy the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other completely. One such evening, when the twins were 5 and their oldest children were 12 and 10, Grace reached over and took Thomas's hand. "Do you remember that night by the creek, when you told me you loved me?" she asked. "I remember every moment we have ever spent together," Thomas said truthfully. "You told me you would love me for the rest of your life. You have kept that promise every single day." Her voice was soft with emotion. "I want you to know that being your wife, raising our children with you, building this life together, it has been the greatest joy of my existence. Even with everything we went through to get here, I would not change a single moment because it led us to this." Thomas brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "The day I saw your face on that wanted poster was the worst day of my life, but it was also the beginning of our real story together, because I got to choose you, Grace, not just once, but over and over again. I chose you when I tore down that poster. I chose you when I rode west to find you. I chose you every day we traveled back home, and I choose you now, and I will choose you every day for the rest of our lives." "We chose each other," Grace said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And that makes all the difference." As the years continued to pass, their family grew and flourished. William Jonathan grew into a fine young man who took over much of the ranch work, allowing Thomas to slow down as he approached 50. Elizabeth Marie married a rancher from Wyoming, ironically enough, a good man who treated her well and gave them 3 grandchildren. The twins, Thomas Jr. and James, decided to go into business together, starting a freight company that connected Nebraska City with the growing settlements to the west. They were successful and ambitious, but they always made time to come home for Sunday dinners. In 1890, Grace gave birth to their youngest child, a surprise daughter they named Hope. She was a miracle baby, born when Grace was 41, and the doctors had said there would be no more children. Hope was the light of their lives, spoiled by her older siblings and absolutely adored by her parents. Thomas and Grace grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering like the prairie itself. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences and mutual respect. On a warm spring day in 1910, Thomas and Grace celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party that lasted all day. There was food and music and dancing, and as the sun began to set, Thomas led Grace onto the makeshift dance floor in the yard. They moved together slowly, comfortably, no longer needing words to communicate. Around them, their family watched with affection, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious. A love that had endured through time and hardship, that had been tested and proven unbreakable. "You remember our wedding dance?" Grace asked, smiling up at her husband. "I remember stepping on your toes at least 3 times, Thomas said with a laugh. "You have improved considerably," she teased. "I have had a lot of practice." He pulled her closer. "Grace, you have made me the happiest man alive. Every day with you has been a gift." "Every day with you has been an adventure," she replied. "From that moment you kicked down the door at the Holloway Ranch to this very moment now, you have been my hero, my partner, my everything." Their youngest daughter, Hope, who was now 20 and engaged to be married herself, watched her parents dance with tears in her eyes. "That is what I want," she told her older brother William. "That is the kind of love I want to find." William smiled, his own children playing at his feet. "Then you must find someone who will tear down wanted posters for you, ride across territories to find you, and fight the world to keep you safe. That is what Papa did for Mama, and that is why their love has lasted." As the stars came out and the celebration continued around them, Thomas and Grace slipped away to their favorite spot, the creek where they had played as children, where Thomas had first kissed Grace, where he had proposed to her the night before he went to Cheyenne. They sat on the bank, listening to the gentle burble of the water, the distant sounds of their family's laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "If you could go back," Thomas asked, "back to that February morning when you left, knowing everything that would happen, would you do anything differently?" Grace thought about it seriously. "I would have trusted you sooner. I would have let you help me from the beginning instead of trying to protect you by leaving. But beyond that, no. Because everything we went through led us here to this moment, to this beautiful life we have built." "I would not change a thing," Thomas agreed. "Except maybe I would have looked at that bulletin board sooner, found your poster sooner, reached you even one day earlier." Grace laughed softly. "You found me at exactly the right time. You have always found me at exactly the right time, Thomas Garrett. That is your gift." They sat together in the darkness, 2 people who had loved each other through the best and worst of times, who had chosen each other again and again, who had built something lasting and true. The Wild West that had once been so dangerous and uncertain had transformed into a home, a place of safety and love, because they had made it so together. Thomas took Grace's hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the wedding ring that had worn a groove into her finger after 38 years. "I love you, Grace Gardner Garrett. I loved you when we were children. I loved you when you were missing. I loved you when you were wanted for murder. I love you now as my wife, my partner, my best friend, and I will love you always, long past the end of our days together. And I love you, Thomas Garrett. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You saved my life and then you made it worth living." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for seeing that poster. Thank you for tearing it down. Thank you for coming to find me. I would cross 1,000 territories, face 1,000 dangers just to find you again," Thomas said simply. "That is what love does. That is what love is." They walked back to the party hand in hand, returning to their children and grandchildren, to the life they had built through determination, courage, and an unshakable love. The wanted poster that had once threatened to destroy Grace's life had instead become the catalyst for their greatest adventure, the beginning of a love story that would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren for generations to come. Years later, long after Thomas and Grace had passed on, their descendants would find that original wanted poster pressed carefully in a family Bible, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. The crude drawing of Grace's face, the false accusations, the $500 reward, it had all seemed like the end of everything. But instead, it had been the beginning of the most beautiful love story the Garrett family had ever known. The tale was told and retold, about the cowboy who saw the woman he loved on a wanted poster, who tore it down without hesitation, who rode across the territories to find her. About how he had fought to clear her name, how he had never wavered in his belief in her innocence, how their love had conquered fear and injustice and distance. In the end, that is what endures. Not the hardship, not the years of separation, not the false accusations or the long journey to justice. What endures is the love, fierce and loyal and true, the kind of love that changes everything, that makes heroes out of ordinary people, that writes itself into legend. Thomas and Grace Garrett lived long, happy lives filled with children, grandchildren, joy and love. They died within months of each other in 1918, both in their late 80s, having spent nearly 50 years as husband and wife. They were buried side by side in the cemetery outside Nebraska City, under a shared headstone that bore a simple inscription, "Together always." And that truly was how it had always been and how it would always be. Together. From the moment Thomas tore down that poster until their final days, and beyond into whatever came next. Together, always, forever. A love story written in the Wild West, in dust and determination and devotion. A story that proved that true love could overcome any obstacle, survive any trial, and last beyond the bounds of time itself. The ranch they built together still stands today, passed down through generations of Garretts, each one learning the story of how it all began with a wanted poster, a determined cowboy, and a woman worth fighting for. The creek still flows where Thomas and Grace spent so many evenings together, and sometimes, on quiet spring nights, you can almost imagine you see two figures sitting by the water, holding hands, their love as eternal as the stars above. That is the legacy of Thomas and Grace Garrett. Not just a family or a ranch or a place in history, but a love that refused to be denied, that overcame impossible odds, that became the foundation for everything that followed. It is a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the greatest blessings, that love is worth fighting for, that choosing each other again and again is what builds a life worth living. And so the story ends as all the best stories do, with love triumphant, with a family flourishing, with a legacy that extends far beyond the two people who started it all. Thomas and Grace Garrett found each other against all odds, fought for each other with unwavering determination, and loved each other with a depth and devotion that transformed both their lives and the lives of everyone who came after them. In the Wild West of the 1870s, where life was hard and justice was uncertain, they proved that love could still conquer all, that hope could survive even the darkest times, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is simply refuse to give up on the people they love. Thomas saw Grace's face on a wanted poster, tore it down, and rode to find her. That single act of love and faith set in motion a chain of events that led to justice, redemption, and a lifetime of happiness. Their story became a legend, passed down through the generations, a testament to the power of love and the courage of two people who refused to let fear or injustice keep them apart. And in the end, that is what matters most. Not the obstacles they faced, but how they faced them together. Not the years they spent apart, but the lifetime they spent united. Not the poster that declared Grace a criminal, but the love that proved her innocent and brought her home. Thomas and Grace Garrett lived there happily ever after in the Wild West, proving that even in the harshest, most unforgiving landscape, love could not only survive but flourish, creating beauty and legacy and joy that would last for generations. They chose each other, fought for each other, and built a life together that became the foundation for an entire family's future. And that, truly, is a love story worth telling, a reminder that the greatest adventures often begin with a single choice, a moment of courage, and a love that refuses to be denied. Their children grew strong and good, their grandchildren carried on the family name with pride, and their great-grandchildren still gather at the old ranch house to hear the story of how it all began, with a wanted poster, a determined cowboy, and a love that conquered all. The Wild West may have been tamed, the frontier may have faded into history, but the love story of Thomas and Grace Garrett remains as vivid and inspiring as the day it began, a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever loved, anyone who has ever fought for what matters, anyone who believes that love is worth any risk, any sacrifice, any journey, no matter how long or how difficult. And so, in the end, Thomas and Grace got everything they had dreamed of as young lovers planning their future beside the creek, the ranch, the children, the lifetime together. They got more than that, actually. They got a love tested by fire and proven true, a love that became legendary, a love that showed everyone who knew them what was possible when two people committed completely to each other. The wanted poster that once threatened to end Grace's life, instead, became the catalyst for their greatest happiness. The journey that seemed impossible led them exactly where they needed to be. And the love that had always existed between them finally got the chance to flourish without fear or obstacle, creating a legacy that would last long after both of them had passed from this world into the next, together always. Just as Thomas had promised on that autumn evening so many years ago when he asked Grace to marry him, and she said yes, 1,000 times yes, beginning the greatest adventure of both their lives.